Conor Benn actually called out Chris Eubank Jr. after Eubank Jr.'s win over the weekend against Liam Williams. Before I dismiss this fight just offhand, I have to harken back to fights such as Amir Khan versus Canelo Alvarez, to fights such as Kell Brook versus Gennady Golovkin, because we didn't think those fights would be possible, particularly Khan versus Canelo. I mean, even early on in Canelo's career, when he was a welterweight, there was some talk about him fighting Chavez Jr. at some stage. And even when he stepped up to 154 pounds, they were still talking about that happening. And I forget exactly the timeline and the chronology when all these things happened. But Chavez Jr., of course, did hold a version of the middleweight title for a while. And he was absolutely massive for the weight. I mean, he was like a borderline cruiserweight fighting at 160 pounds. He was huge at one stage. And at that point, him versus Canelo did not seem realistic at all. But obviously it's happened since. So I'm hesitant to dismiss the possibility that Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. could actually fight each other, especially bearing in mind that Conor Benn is quite a bit younger than Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. I think is what, 32? Something like that, 32, 33. Conor Benn, much younger. And so why I think that has to be considered is because if Chris Eubank Jr. is sufficiently over the hill, then Conor Benn in his prime, and he's not yet in his prime, but once he reaches his prime, it makes a fight between two guys who are so different in size more realistic when one of them is over the hill and the other one's in their prime. Now, in terms of the size difference, I've seen both these guys in person multiple times. Conor Benn is a little guy. I mean, if you see him in person, he's a small guy. The first time I saw Chris Eubank Jr. was many years ago at Notting Hill Carnival, and he must be a solid 5'11", 6 foot. Conor Benn, little guy, I don't know what he is, 5'7", 5'8". He's a very small, slender guy. And if you saw them side by, I haven't seen them side by side, but I've seen them on multiple occasions separate from each other. So, but if you did see them side by side, the size difference is massive. Definitely massive. And at this stage, if you were to put them in the ring and allow them to fight, surely Chris Eubank Jr. would win. Conor Benn, of course, is fast. He can move his head and so on. But how would he be able to do what Liam Williams couldn't do and actually get to Chris Eubank Jr.? Remember, he's smaller than Liam Williams. So if Liam Williams, a guy bigger than Conor Benn, can't get to you, and Conor Benn's a small welterweight, by the way. Eubank Jr. is a decent-sized middleweight. I don't want to say he's big. He's a decent-sized middleweight. Conor Benn is a small welterweight. And if a middleweight like Liam Williams wasn't able to successfully walk Eubank Jr. down and get to him, and he was kept on the end of a jab, and he's not as short as Conor Benn, how's Conor Benn supposed to do it? Obviously, Benn has certain things that Liam Williams doesn't have, but overall, I would find it high. I'd be very surprised. Let's just put it that way. If Conor Benn were able to beat Chris Eubank Jr., very, very surprised at this stage. But down the line, if Eubank Jr. is a little over the hill, who knows? And of course, Eubank Jr. says he's open to the Conor Benn fight in future, and why wouldn't he be? Because of the legacies that their fathers both have. Of course, the Benn and the Eubank names are synonymous with each other. So for nostalgia purposes and to rekindle that family rivalry, I can imagine there must be some desire to face each other. And also, of course, lest I forget, there's the monetary aspect, because you got Conor Benn, who seemingly right now isn't willing to face David Avanesian, or at least his team are not willing to put him in the ring against David Avanesian, who's a welterweight like he is, but yet he's talking about fighting a guy who's a middleweight. And you're thinking, okay, how does that make sense? Well, it makes sense financially. It makes sense in terms of family legacy. That's where it makes sense. So it is what it is. A strange fight. I'm not saying that's a fight I want to see straight away. I'm not saying that's a fight that I would rather over Benn versus Avanesian or whoever else at welterweight. No, I'm just saying I understand why both of these guys would be interested in such a fight. And I also understand why the public, to some degree, would be interested in such a fight for nostalgia reasons. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below about the prospect of Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. fighting each other.